Hello and welcome to our Agri-Pulse webinar on rural issues and ag issues facing Congress here in this 117th session and the year 2021. Certainly want to appreciate all of you taking the time to join us and want to take the time to appreciate our guests for joining us as well. We have Congressman Dusty Johnson from the state of South Dakota and Kip Eideberg from the Association of Equipment Manufacturers. Later, we'll hear from Virginia Democrat Abigail Spanberger. I'm going to keep my remarks short. My name is Spencer Chase. I'm the managing editor with Agri-Pulse Communications. Like I said, I'm going to keep my remarks short because I know that you did not necessarily dial into this webinar to hear from me. And so with that in mind, I will open things up to comments from Congressman Johnson. Would be interested to hear your thoughts in relation to what you see as kind of the top ag and rural issues that will be facing Congress here in the 117th Congress and specifically the year 2021.
Well, thanks, Spencer, and thanks to Agri-Pulse. Obviously, you guys are, really leading. You're a leading source for thought leaders in ag who want to understand not only what's going on now, but what's going to happen just around the corner. That's incredibly important. And I think we're at a bit of a crossroads from a tone perspective. I'm on the House Ag Committee, as is Abigail, and that committee has a long-standing tradition of bipartisanship. And I think that may be a little more difficult to maintain. And so I know, listen, I'm dedicated to maintaining it. I suspect Congresswoman Spanberger is as well. We all know farm country does a lot better when we don't engage in the kind of partisan bickering that so many other committees have as their standard. But I think we are entering a potentially more difficult environment because there are a lot of folks, my colleagues on the left, who I think want to use a lot of ag policy vehicles really to also attack environment and to address climate and carbon. And of course, we want to be good stewards, and there is plenty that we can do together on that front. But it is going to be more difficult, I think, to craft bipartisanship if we're not focused just on ag policy in the Ag Committee. And I'll just give you one example, recent example. We recently had an all-day reconciliation vote on the House budget, and almost every single vote, and in fact, I think every vote save one, was along party lines. And so for just all of you out in farm and ranch country, try to reinforce to your members of Congress and try to reinforce to your thought leaders in ag country that we do really need an ag policy that continues to be bipartisan, because that's really good for the whole country. So real quick, Spencer, you asked about, the big issues. And it's not just going to be about tone, but the three that I would hit with: number one, we've got mandatory price reporting that the House Ag Committee is going to need to address. And I think that will give us an opportunity, that'll give us a vehicle to talk about some livestock issues that probably need addressing. I've got a number of bills that we'll talk about later today that I think will help from a transparency and a competition perspective. And so I'm looking forward to trying to advance those, and those have been bipartisan, the things that I brought forward, and I know they will be in the future. Number two, trade. I think we have a lot of opportunity to increase market opportunities for American producers. And we've had a great price rally on the row crop side, and we've had some recovering prices on the livestock side. If we're going to keep that good news coming, it is going to be because of more market opportunities for producers. So we want to keep that going. And I don't think, clearly, I want to make sure that the Biden administration continues the progress we've made in the last year or two, and we don't want to do any backsliding, because a number of those structural gains we made were hard fought for, and frankly, ag producers were the tip of the spear in a really uncomfortable way for many of those gains. And then finally, the thing I would mention, I know the Farm Bill seems like it's an eternity away. It really is not. We are laying the groundwork today for the next Farm Bill. And this is going to be a key year, to the extent that members are putting down markers, to the extent that they're trying to carve out, policy arenas that they want to take some ownership of, to the extent that they want to crowdsource these ideas with the ag community. This is going to be the year where so many of those seeds are planted. We're going to want to make sure that we water them, that we cultivate them, so that when we get to the Farm Bill, we have something that is going to be predictable and something that is not going to surprise or frankly pinch the ag community. So those are my opening thoughts, Spencer. Thanks.
We appreciate that, Congressman, and I should note that that in my haste to hear from the Congressman, I did forget to read off an intro, but I do want to note that one thing that will be important in the context, especially of this conversation, Congressman is also a member of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, and looking forward to hearing his thoughts from that perspective as well as we advance in our conversation.
And as you can see, Spencer, I'm also a collector of great artwork by young people.
Of course, yes. And who isn't, really? Definitely a more creative backdrop than I've got here with my, I don't know, prison cellar approach here with all this brick. Anyways.
Now, most people would assume that it should be the politician is the one who should be in a jail cell.
Well, a lot of people wouldn't be too opposed to the reporter being in it either, really. We will now turn the conversation over to Kip Eideberg. Kip is the Senior Vice President of Government and Industry Relations for AEM. He previously worked as the Vice President for Public Affairs and Advocacy for AEM, and prior to that, as Partner and Director of Public Affairs for Finn Partners, and as a VP for Edelman. And Kip, we offer your thoughts on the same subject, what you see as the big ag and rural policy issues here in the new year.
Well, thank you, Spencer, and thank you to the Congressman for being part of this, I think, timely and important discussion, and obviously to Congresswoman Spanberger as well. I thought I had a pretty good background going this morning, but I got to say that the Congressman is putting me to shame, although I do want to talk a little bit about the equipment that's behind me, because I think it plays an important role in the future of rural America. But I think very briefly, Spencer, as equipment manufacturers, our point of view on all of this is pretty straightforward. And that is that strong rural communities that provide Americans with quality education, state-of-the-art infrastructure, economic certainty for our farmers and our ranchers, and family-sustaining jobs are critical to the long-term success of rural communities, of equipment manufacturers, and of our country. Because when rural America succeeds, we succeed as equipment manufacturers. And I think it's important to note that, yes, the 2.8 million men and women of our industry who make the equipment that feeds, powers, and builds the world, they're machinists, they're fabricators, they're painters, they're engineers, they're inventors, but many of them are also farmers and ranchers. And in fact, 1 in 3 of them live and work in rural communities, compared to 1 in 5 people overall in the United States. So equipment manufacturers are not only part of rural communities, we are deeply connected and invested in them. And so when rural America succeeds, we succeed as an industry. But unfortunately, the opposite is also true. And you know, and your readers and listeners know, that the past 12 months have been challenging for rural America. Many communities were hard hit by the COVID-19 pandemic and the ensuing economic crisis. And this impact was exacerbated by a number of underlying factors that I hope we'll address today. I know some of them are dear to Congressman Johnson's heart. Rural America is still waiting on reliable high-speed broadband. And that is a big problem if you live in rural communities and if you make equipment in rural communities. And over 30% of rural roads are in poor or mediocre condition. This is according to a recent report by TRIP, the Road Information Program. And on top of that, farmers have been battered by low commodity prices. We're seeing some positive news on that front recently, but that has had an impact over the past 12 months, the trade war with China and mounting bankruptcy. So there's a number of challenges that we all need to address. And I think this is why we need policies that help revitalize rural America and strengthen the manufacturing sector. And so what do those policies look like, Spencer? You talked about priorities for this Congress. Well, I think it's policies that provide farmers and ranchers with the tools they need to manage risk, open up more markets for U.S. commodities, and certainly for U.S. equipment as well, ensure a regulatory system that is fair and transparent, and finally, enable the technology that farmers need to grow more food while improving the environment. And if we can do all of that, I think that we are going to be on the pathway to a healthy, a vibrant rural America. And finally, on that, the Congressman mentioned bipartisanship. I want to stress, I think this is important. A healthy, vibrant rural America is not a Democratic or Republican priority. It is a national priority. And we all need to work together to advance a common sense, bipartisan solutions to many of these challenges that are facing rural America. Some of them the Congressman touched on. I mentioned a few of them. And I think what that requires is more of a national effort towards a rural economic development strategy in partnership with rural communities, because it cannot be a Washington top-down approach. It has to be collaborative. We have to figure out a way to invest in their unique assets. But I think the overarching goal of giving more young people more options to live and work and raise the next generation of rural America. And finally, I would be remiss, because the Congressman brought it up, if I did not say that we as an industry, the 2.8 million men and women that build all of this great equipment, we really appreciate his and Congresswoman Spanberger's commitment to bipartisanship and their active involvement in the House Problem Solvers Caucus. I think bipartisanship is the only viable path forward to solving rural America's and our nation's most pressing challenges. So thank you to both of them for that. And I look forward to the conversation today, Spencer. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Kip. And as you mentioned, in that spirit of bipartisanship, I'm sure as many of you noticed when you signed up or registered or saw promotions for this event, we did have Congresswoman Spanberger on the agenda. Unfortunately, due to an unforeseen event, a funeral in her district, she was not able to join us. And so first and foremost, we do offer our condolences to her and to her community, but also want to extend our appreciation to the fact that she was willing to set up a time to pre-record some comments as well as answer a few questions earlier this week. And so we do have that video locked and loaded and ready to go, and we'll play that for you just as soon as I can figure out the necessary technology to make that happen. We will bring you the Congresswoman's comments. And now we'll turn to Virginia Democrat Abigail Spanberger, who last month began her second term as a member of the House of Representatives. Before her time in Congress, Spanberger's public service began as an agent with the U.S. Postal Inspection Service and as a case officer with the CIA. As a member of Congress, Spanberger serves on the House Ag Committee. And just as an aside, I don't know that you are the only House Ag member with CIA experience, maybe even the history of the panel, but if not the, you've got to be one of the only with that on the resume. On that panel, she serves as and was recently named to another term as the chair of the panel's Conservation and Forestry Subcommittee. Also in the House, she is a member of the Foreign Affairs Committee and a vice chair of the Bipartisan Problem Solvers Caucus. And Congresswoman Spanberger, we'll throw it to you for any thoughts you might happen to have on what you think will be on that ag and rural policy agenda as we work our way through 2021.
Well, Spencer, thank you so much for having me, and to all of the Agri-Pulse watchers, thank you for inviting me to participate in this event today. I am sorry that I'm not able to join live on Friday, but I'm so grateful to be able to join you in advance. This also means that I am missing the opportunity to be with my dear colleague, Dusty Johnson, but I'm sure he will do all of the heavy lifting in making this an entertaining and interesting and informative event. So as Spencer mentioned, I'm Abigail Spanberger. I represent Central Virginia in Congress, and our district, it's 10 counties in total, and 8 of those counties are predominantly rural and heavily agricultural. 2 of our counties are suburban. So I have been so excited to serve on the Agriculture Committee and to chair the Conservation and Forestry Subcommittee because I have a background that is not in agriculture. I'm a former CIA officer. I can barely keep houseplants alive, which means that I am a blank slate when it comes to issues of ag policy and priorities. I have to do all of my learning from the people I represent across my district. And so I have spent time, it's a bit adjusted during COVID, but I've spent time meeting with the groups across my district, meeting with farmers across our district, touring farms, dairies, the whole gamut. You know, we've got a really tremendous agricultural community within our district. We've got greenhouses to the northern portion of the district. We've got cattle and row crop operations. We've got dairies. We really have it all across our district. And I've been able to learn so much from the folks that I represent. And that's really what drives my priorities. Because of what I hear directly from the people I represent, you know, my priorities are really focused on issues like broadband connectivity. Because as one producer told me quite some time ago, farmers are the original work from home folks. And the way that we do business this century is internet. And so everything from being able to update machinery to communicate with buyers and suppliers, internet really, really matters. On the Conservation and Forestry Subcommittee, my goal here is to bring the conversation that is happening in Congress, to bring farmers to that discussion. And frankly, I think that at times, you know, I'm a Democrat. I think that at times Democratic discussion of the larger climate crisis has missed an opportunity to, you know, learn from what's happening in the agricultural space, to learn from what conservation practices are being employed across the country, to learn why rotational grazing matters and is good for the farmer's bottom line, and also is great for the environment, or learn why so many producers across the country are utilizing precision technology, why they're utilizing cover crops, and like the real value there. And so in my role as chair of conservation and forestry, I have been really focused on bringing the voices of producers to the table, including some folks from my own district who have come to testify before Congress. So those are some of the major priorities. Again, I'm so excited to be with you all. And I will say that Dusty Johnson is an incredible member. He's also a colleague on the Problem Solvers Caucus. We have spent hours upon hours on Zooms and on conference calls, and I have nothing but wonderful things to say about him. Although he did get the office in Congress in the Longworth office building, that was our dream office. So while I still maintain my significant love and appreciation for Dusty Johnson, there's an entire office full of Spanberger staffers on the 4th floor of Longworth that are very distressed that they are not on the 7th floor of Longworth in Dusty's wonderful office, but we'll get over it.
It just wouldn't be a farm policy conversation without some kind of a real estate component. So I appreciate you letting us know.
There you go.
So looking to kind of pivot things into a question and answer session now, and we appreciate your thoughts and the thoughts of the other folks on the panel as well. But as we look kind of into diving into some specific issues, one of the things that no matter what policy area you're talking about, you're going to need someone to actually put a shovel in the ground and do it. Yeah. And you have introduced some legislation along with Congressman Upton on that subject using the SNAP ENT program. We've also seen the House vote on some language that you authored in regards to apprenticeships. So I guess as you kind of zoom out and look at, not just farm policy, not just, some of these specifics on your legislation, what do you assess as kind of the current needs of the American workforce and what Congress might need to do in order to kind of grease the wheels on that front?
Yeah, well, and Spencer, thanks for mentioning a couple of the pieces of legislation that I have been working on. One is ensuring that localities and programs in communities that help retrain or train workers have access to available grant dollars. And the SNAP ENT program is a fantastic one because it's targeted at individuals who already by their SNAP eligibility are facing economic hardship. And so ensuring that they're that we as a community, as a country, are making the investment in getting those folks the training they need to get good jobs in the workforce is incredibly important. I've worked on another piece of legislation that I just introduced with Congresswoman Young Kim from California that is would allocate grant dollars available for small businesses and localities to be able to ensure the safety of their workplace for their workers, for their customers. Because as we are kind of building ourselves out of the COVID crisis and the economic implications, there's going to be the immediacy of ensuring that not only are our businesses safe and as safe as they can be, as so many business owners, and producers and on the ag side, there's greenhouses and you name it in the supply chain line, have worked to make their work sites safer, their businesses safer. We also need to make sure that consumers and customers and people who might walk through those business doors know that steps are being taken. So that's going to be the immediacy of things that need to happen on the ground. But as we have seen real shifts in the way people are working, a move to work from home in some industries where available, and then a loss of jobs that might never come back. I have another piece of legislation that would allow for savings vehicles to be utilized, the 529 savings vehicle to be able to be utilized for credentialing and certification programs. So giving people the flexibility to be able to save for a program that might help them as they pivot into potentially a new job opportunity. And so these are the sorts of things that I'm thinking about of how do we look towards the future of what jobs are going to be available and how we can really foundationally strengthen the economy. And broadband, frankly, is an element of that because so many of the communities that I represent, the rural communities where broadband is an issue, it matters to the workforce that they can recruit. It matters to the folks who might be able to work from home who would want to move back, let's say, to Louisa County where they grew up in my district or to Nottoway County. And those folks, maybe they wouldn't work there locally, but they'd live there. They'd be involved in the community. They might go out to restaurants. And that revenue stream for that local community is so vitally important to have somebody who's a taxpayer, a homeowner, living and giving back to a community that they either choose to make their own or potentially one that they grew up in. And so much of that is going to be whether or not transferable jobs can actually be transferred to rural communities. And without broadband internet infrastructure, currently there's so many communities where they can't.
Well, and you kind of led me into my next question there, because broadband deployment is not a new topic. It's
Right.
something that's been a major issue in all kinds of legislation for years now, and we've seen frankly a lot of money from the federal government and from a lot of state governments that have been directed toward this issue through various USDA and FCC programs. Specifically in these last couple of years, I think the gas pedals have been pushed down a little bit harder, but knowing what we know now, what changes do we need to take to the federal government's broadband deployment approach, especially in the wake of, as one person put it to me, in the COVID-19 pandemic, your broadband access was more important than the road in front of your house. Knowing what we know now in all of these, the recent years, what do we need to tweak about our broadband approach?
So the way that I would describe our broadband approach thus far has been complementary efforts, right? And so depending upon where you live, sometimes those complementary efforts lead up to a patchwork that gets you and your community members access to internet. Depending upon where you live, that patchwork might leave you in a hole where you don't have access. And so the Reconnect program, which is an excellent program, a federal grant program that communities can apply for, and it's been very valuable. It's been very valuable in my district. My first year in Congress, I worked initially to increase funding to that program and then ultimately to protect funding when the Senate zeroed it out in their funding bills. But notably, it requires the kind of push of a local community, the organization of a local community, which is not necessarily, which is not necessarily the fastest way to reach that need. And it means, as it does in my district, that in some places, a county that is serviced by a rural electric co-op is able to join portions of that county or united with another portion of the county based on a service area. And then those folks get internet. And so the neighbor down the street becomes sandwiched. And so in that patchwork, there are holes. And from an overall kind of economic community regional effort, the problem here becomes that when we're looking at it, we're saying, okay, Louisa County's got it, again, using my district, Louisa County's got internet, Goochland County's got internet, and you go up, Culpeper's got it, Orange has got it, some issues. But in fact, it's not the full county. It's not every person in that community. There are significant swaths of those communities where broadband internet connectivity is not possible. And so I think we've given ourselves a little bit of a false sense of our success. Now, there are other places across the country outside of my district where there's just no access, and there's no access for counties. And so it's a lot clearer that absence is there. And so the patchwork approach has been good for taking steps forward. But really at this point, as we now realize, to use your example, that broadband infrastructure is just as important as the road in front of your house, or just as important as the light bulbs that we can turn on, we need to have a far more, from coast to coast effort to ensure that connectivity. And frankly, it needs to be one larger scale, focused effort to fill in those holes and lay down those patches in places where it hasn't been available. And this is frankly particularly important from a healthcare standpoint. I talked a lot about the economics of it, but rural communities really, really are impacted by lack of internet access, particularly as there's so many advances when it comes to telehealth services. And this particularly impacts veterans, as well as the Veterans Administration has pretty substantial telehealth services that they've offered. And so to round it out and ultimately get to the answer of your question, there's a bill that's called the Affordable Accessible Internet for All Act that recognizes internet access as an infrastructure issue. And so this bill, which we passed in the House last year as part of the larger HR2 infrastructure bill, it did pass. It did not move in the Senate, and it is really focused on a organized, strategic approach to ensure that we are pushing internet coast to coast. And basic things is it requires that internet service providers who are built with the taxpayer funds coming through this program would offer affordable options. So it's ensuring that the access is there, and then ensuring that people can actually use it is really kind of part and parcel of this large scale approach. So I'm continuing to work to build a coalition focused on recognizing internet as an infrastructure. It has become far more of a straightforward endeavor in the time of COVID, because now people understand how vital it is.
I want to wrap up on kind of a very touchy and very important subject on Capitol Hill and the administration, what have you. We saw in the early days of the Biden administration, folks saying that every department is going to look at climate concerns. We've seen some talk on Capitol Hill that, pretty much every major piece of legislation is going to have, climate concerns, climate issues addressed within it. As I'm sure a lot of times in production agriculture, when folks start talking climate, producers can get a little nervous. You mentioned in your opening statement, sometimes as the Democratic Party can have some issues connecting, the climate benefits to agriculture. So to my point about producers getting a little nervous when all of this climate talk is happening, should they be?
I would argue no. And I am going to do everything I need to do to ensure that the administration doesn't make people nervous. And the way that you don't make people nervous about this is to be clear about what we're talking about, right? So across the board, climate change is a significant issue. And it's a significant issue that we should want to address. I think some of the reasons that producers may get nervous is because oftentimes their livelihood is brought into the conversation as the culprit. And I would argue that that is not a fair assessment. And in our district and across our subcommittee, the Conservation and Forestry Subcommittee, we are focused on how producers are actually part of the solution, from the farming practices that they may be employing, be it cover crops, be it rotational grazing, be it the utilization of precision ag technologies that allow them to minimize the inputs of potential chemicals that might be more challenging for the environment, but optimize their output. And what I think we've been missing is we haven't been bringing those voices to the table. Certainly not enough. And I've heard that in my district. I've heard from my district that under the Obama administration, they didn't necessarily feel that their opinions were listened to. And to be frank, there may be disagreements along the way, but my perspective is that in addressing the issue of climate change, our farmers and producers are part of the solution. We should celebrate them, we should learn from them, and we should ensure that whatever programs we are putting forward are programs that they can choose to participate in, that have a benefit to the environment, but also have a benefit to them in their operations. And I'll give one example of a bill that I'm very proud of, which is the Growing Climate Solutions Act. And this is a bill that's pretty straightforward. At the federal level, we can do more to support farmers, producers, foresters who want to participate in climate-friendly practices. And so this bill, it creates an opportunity for those who want to participate in the carbon market to be able to do so. So there would be technical assistance for farmers who want to enroll in the carbon marketplace, where people would be certified through USDA. So a known entity, anyone who wants to engage in this space, that someone's been certified by the USDA. And it would be to support ongoing efforts related to carbon sequestration, grassland management, and on-site energy generation. And so basically the focus here is that for farmers who want to participate in this program and want to make an additional revenue stream because of their grassland management practices, or because of the rotational grazing practices that are sequestering carbon in the ground, they can do it. And they can create that revenue stream for themselves and for their farm into the future. And so, I think this is an example of the types of conversations that we should be having and finding out for farmers who want to employ certain practices, what stands in the way. And sometimes it's funding, it's capital. And so where we can be supportive from a federal perspective, through grants, through loan programs, for producers to be able to employ these programs and not force them to, but say these, we know the end result is financially beneficial for the stability and the growth and the output of your farm. These are programs that we want to put in place and support. And I would just note the bill that I mentioned has significant support from farm groups, from the American Farm Bureau to the American Soybean Association to the National Corn Growers Association on the ag side. And then we also have from the conservation side, like the National Wildlife Foundation or Federation. And then in industry, we've got groups like Ocean Spray that recognize that this is, a way for them to engage with producers in this marketplace, if they so choose. That's good for the environment, good for our efforts to address climate change, but ultimately good for the producer. So that's my argument, and I'll keep making it.
Fair enough. Well, I tell you what, there's a long list of things we could continue to discuss, and a lot of the world's problems that we could solve here. But I think we're going to put a lid on it now, and look forward to catching up with you at the next earliest available possible opportunity. So,
Wonderful.
Congressman Spanberger, thanks for your time.
Thank you, Spencer. Thank you, and thank you to everybody listening.
So we'll bring the conversation back to Congressman Johnson and Kip, and obviously Congresswoman Spanberger touched on quite a few different subjects there. But Congressman Johnson, I want to start with you on a subject that we didn't necessarily have time to discuss with Congresswoman Spanberger, and that is the issue of broader infrastructure legislation. It seems like anytime someone talks about dreams of Capitol Hill bipartisanship, I think infrastructure is the first piece of legislation that they mention. So, but given the current political climate that we're in, given the current undercurrents that we're facing in politics, is broad bipartisan infrastructure legislation something that you see as potentially workable in this 117th Congress?
Yeah, let me first note that Congresswoman Spanberger did a great job. I mean, I think anybody who's watching can just tell by her demeanor that she's one of the good ones. She's got a real heart for this work, and I think that comes through. She's a ton of fun to be around. Frankly, many members of Congress are a bore. That is not the case with Abigail. She is one of the good ones. But I hope infrastructure, throughout our country's history, infrastructure has been like the bipartisan issue, along with farm policy. It's been the bipartisan issue. And again, I think we see some cracks in that foundation, which is too bad. Sam Graves is the top Republican on the House Transportation Infrastructure Committee. He noted to me that last year's highway bill, surface transportation bill, was the first one in his long career that he was not able to vote for. It was a party line vote out of committee. It was a party line vote out of the House. That is the first time ever. And I'm really not looking to assign blame, other than just note that I think we're running into the same issues with infrastructure that we're running into with farm policy, in that there are just different, I think my friends on the other side of the aisle are trying to figure out how much are these vehicles for environmental change as well. And the more aggressive you get in making them environmental legislation, the harder it is to pull together a bipartisan coalition. Now, listen, Abigail was exactly right. Producers are a huge part of the environmental solutions of the future. And so there is a lot. I don't want to insinuate that being good stewards of the environment is a partisan issue. It's not. But we need to acknowledge that some of the tactics, some of the tools, some of the policies on the environmental side can divide Congress in a way that, frankly, just building good highways does not divide Congress. Does that make sense, Spencer?
Well, it does. And just on the subject of infrastructure legislation, if I would assume as a member now of the Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, you'll have some say in at least the Republican priorities on a bill. So, should we get to a point where legislation is actually being drafted and we're turning priorities into policy, what do you need to see to be able to put your support behind a piece of legislation? And what do you think would be good policies to turn into policy?
So my number one goal would be, we need to acknowledge that infrastructure is a national priority. And I think that's important for rural America because, and America has always done policy best when that's how we viewed it. Look at rural electrification. We said we're going to have one America, not an America that's light and an America that's dark, but one America that's all electrified. Look at universal service, where we got dial tone everywhere. We said there is something called network value that says the larger the network is, the more value it has for everybody on the network. So the example I think about is, listen, if a Manhattan telephone could only call other people in Manhattan, it is a very limited use. You wanted to be able to pick up the telephone and call Texas and call California and call South Dakota. And the same is true for an interstate highway system. Yes, South Dakota gets more transportation dollars in than we pay out, but that's not because South Dakotans deserve the best interstate. It's because 80% of the traffic on South Dakota's interstates both originate and terminate outside of South Dakota. It's a national infrastructure. So to answer your question, Spencer, when we start talking about infrastructure, I want to make sure that we are taking care of not only the donor states, but also the donee states. Because if we just say South Dakota's got to eat what it kills from a transportation perspective, our nation will be less well off.
So, Kip, I want to bring you into the conversation here as well. And I would just note, as an aside to those that are watching this here on Facebook, would encourage you, if you have questions for either of these two panelists, to go ahead and drop them in the comments, and we'll hopefully be able to get to a couple of those thoughts here later on in our discussion. But Kip, we had a chance to talk with Congresswoman Spanberger about some of her legislation on the in the area of the workforce, and obviously AEM has a pretty unique perspective on this, given the companies that you represent and the work that they do here in the country. Wondering, what does successful workforce development, reform, whatever term you'd like to use, what does successful workforce action look like from the perspective of AEM?
Yeah, Spencer, that's a great question. And maybe the way to approach that, if you will indulge me, is to stay on the topic of infrastructure just for a second, because I think what the congressman said is really, really important. I think we got to stop thinking small when it comes to infrastructure. It is about roads and bridges, but it is about our quality of life ultimately. And it is about creating more jobs for more young people. And let me give you an example. We've got member companies across the country. We have many of them in the great state of South Dakota. Now, if you're building equipment in Yankton or in Madison, you're not exactly close to the coasts. There isn't exactly a large international airport around the corner, right? And so you depend on infrastructure to get the parts and components into Madison or to Yankton, and then get the equipment out to markets, not only in the US, but around the globe. And if you cannot do that, you're not going to be in South Dakota for much longer. And I'm not just picking in South Dakota. It's the same if you are in, Louisville, Mississippi, or if you're in Pella, Iowa, right? We need that infrastructure for our quality of life and to be successful. And now pivoting to workforce, right? How are we successful? We got to create more work opportunities for our young people. And we believe that equipment manufacturing overall is a pathway to the middle class. That is how we lift more people up and put them to work. And whether we are investing in our infrastructure, that's going to put a lot of people to work, not just the people that build the roads and the bridges, but the people that build the equipment, and that people that produce all the aggregates and all the stuff that goes into it. It's also going to make us more competitive. So I think it's a couple of things we can do. Workforce is a big challenge for us, and you can approach it. I'm sure the congressman has ideas too. I'm interested to hear them, but it's a tough issue because you can approach it from so many different directions. But I think it starts with educating our young people about the opportunities that exist in other industries that don't require a 4-year degree. It's about getting rid of that stigma. You can have a great career in manufacturing. It's a family sustaining job. You can raise a family. You can put your kids through college or through technical school. You can support them. You can provide for them. You could retire and have a good life. And so we got to start addressing this notion that the only pathway to success in America is a 4-year liberal arts degree. It just isn't true anymore. And look, if we want to rebuild our infrastructure, and I support what the congressman said, 100%, it's got to be bipartisan. It's got to be focused on the issue at hand. I don't want to sound glib about it. I think we get too bogged down into the pay for it. So let's just get it done, because we're investing in our infrastructure. We're investing in our future. It will pay itself back over time. But if we're going to do that, look, we don't have enough people today to build the equipment that our customers demand. So how in the world are we going to rebuild our country if we don't have people to do it. So I think you could marry up an infrastructure investment with a solution to our workforce problem, create more jobs, create more opportunities, and strengthen rural America.
Kip, can you help me better understand the need here when we're talking about workforce and needs for improvement there? Is this an issue of geography? Is this an issue of certain skill sets within the current workforce? Is this an issue of, looking around the corner about the workforce of the future and expressing some concern there? What is the real concrete need here from AEM's perspective?
Yeah, it's great. It's a great question, Spencer. It's all of the above. We don't have enough young people and people in general, really, that have the skills that are required, from 21st century modern manufacturing. It is not your grandfather's manufacturing industry anymore. I mean, yes, we still need welders and fabricators and painters, but we need software engineers and programmers and people that can operate, very sophisticated equipment. You go to some of these facilities and it's autonomous. People are using computers to build this equipment, and yeah, I don't want to paint a sort of an overly futuristic vision, but the jobs are changing. So we don't have enough people who are trained to take on those jobs. We don't have enough young people who I think see a career in manufacturing as a pathway to the middle class. So that's the mentality that we've got to change. And then I think we got to figure out a way to align the needs with where where the people are. And look, aside from the fact that these are family sustaining jobs, think about the quality of life that you can have in rural America if we can figure out some of these challenges. It's a great place to live and raise a family, and that's where a lot of manufacturing is. So let's encourage more people to move to rural America. But to do that, they got to have reliable broadband, they got to have healthcare, clean water, all of that. So I think it's a little bit of everything. But again, as someone who represents a rural state, I'd love to hear what the congressman has to say about it, because I know he hears from his constituents about it all the time.
Yeah, absolutely, Congressman. Interested in hearing what you hear from your constituents in regards to issues surrounding the workforce, especially as we look at broader priorities such as as we talked about with Congresswoman Spanberger. Anything you want to do from an infrastructure, broadband, climate, foreign policy approach, you're going to need someone to be the boots on the ground to actually do it. What are you hearing from your constituents on that front?
Well, don't feel like you got to come to me. When Kip was talking about workforce, he was doing great. I just want to say, preach, brother, preach. That was exactly right. And I thought Congresswoman Spanberger's comments about workforce were good as well. To me, it's three issues. We do have a skills gap, and you're only going to attack that with skills training. Of course, Kip's right. A four-year degree is not the only part of the answer. It is a part of the answer. And I know it's in vogue now to talk about, forgiving $10,000 worth of student loans for everybody across the country. I don't know that attacks the problem. I think it's the wrong approach. I am really open to the idea of doing some things to removing barriers to low-income Americans to get into a two-year technical school or a four-year program or some sort of a certification program. Restoring some of the purchasing power of the Pell Grants. Listen, I'm really interested in that. I think we can build bipartisan support for doing that. Let's target this assistance rather than just sort of writing out checks to everybody in the country. So that's number one, skills gap, make it easier for people to get into some kind of skills training. Number two, we don't only have a skills gap, we got a bodies gap. And Kip was speaking, he was getting my religious fervor into a thick lather when he was talking about youth opportunities. We make it so hard for kids to work these days. And a lot of the federal government regulations are well-intentioned. We want to protect people. But so often when we pass regulations to protect people or companies or communities, we get in their way. It is against federal law for a 15-year-old to work past 8 o'clock on a school night. Are you kidding me? I mean, I learned more working fast food. I learned more washing cars in the bay at the Ford dealership in Pierre than I learned some days in the classroom. And so let's open up these opportunities for kids. Let's tell them we want them there, because when a kid works hard when they're 15, you got a really good shot of them being a hardworking kid when they're 25 or 44. Right. And then the final piece of this to help deal with the bodies gap. Listen, we just don't, we don't have enough people in this country to tackle all of our problems. And President Trump was talking about, having a merit-based immigration system. And I don't know that we've realized where we need to go. And so let's have a real conversation about what types of work programs. Let's have a conversation about what kind of immigration programs. Obviously, this stuff is all legal, right? Let's make sure we're talking about legal pathways to help grow the American economy. And if we do it right, then we're going to make it easier for Americans to make money and build prosperity and create jobs. And it's going to be good for everybody.
Well, I didn't know we were going to get religious fervor whipped up here today, but who knows where a good foreign policy conversation can go. Before we pivot to questions from the audience, I wanted to take my prerogative to ask one last question of my own, and that is that Congresswoman Spanberger touched on this in her remarks as well, the issue of broadband. And, we've all heard, the importance of it. I'm sure AEM has thoughts in regards to the importance for farm equipment. I'm sure the congressman has thoughts. We've all heard the cliche about folks needing to go to the local McDonald's for good Wi-Fi. Obviously, these are issues that need to be confronted. My question is in terms of approach. We've seen a lot of these different USDA FCC programs. Do we know enough now to write some new legislation or write some new implementation of current law in regards to approaching the broadband issue? And I'll ask that to whichever one of you would like to speak first on it.
Kip, you better go. I just got done rambling.
Well, I'll go, but maybe I'll let you address the specifics of Spencer's question. But let me talk just a little bit another aspect of the importance of rural broadband, and the Congresswoman mentioned this in her work on sustainability. Look, today's equipment is incredibly sophisticated, and it is able to accomplish things for farmers and ranchers that was not even possible 20 years ago, let alone 50. And in fact, we just recently released a new study in collaboration with many of those grower groups that the Congresswoman mentioned that looks into the benefits of today's precision technology that comes on the equipment and the enormous positive impact that it can have on farmers and the environment. Now, think about it this way, for example, today's modern farm equipment, the yield benefits through the increased efficiency that technology brings are enormous. You look at fertilizer reduction, pesticide reduction, because you have more precise placement, you have more accurate application. All of this make farmers more effective. It allows them to care for their land because they want to pass it on down to the next generation, hopefully of farm families, right? They are at the forefront of conservation. Let us just be clear about that. This technology helps them accomplish that. But none of that is possible if we don't have reliable high-speed broadband out in rural America. And so to realize the environmental benefits of precision ag, to help advance some of the ideas that the Congresswoman mentioned, we've got to invest in our broadband. And that's not even now taking into account all the other things where rural communities are suffering because of lack of connectivity. Telehealth, for many of our veterans, for example, particularly during a pandemic like the one we are experiencing, it's critical. Education, I think all of us who are parents have all learned a little bit about the importance of reliable internet connection to help our kids get through this through remote learning. I've learned I'm a terrible third grade math teacher, but at least I have reliable connection, right, to the internet so I can help my kids. So think of all those families that are struggling with all the different impact of the pandemic and don't have access to it. So I think from our perspective, you asked Spencer, it is not just about the equipment, although that is a big piece, but it's about all the people that live in rural America that build that equipment, the farmers and ranchers that use it. We just got to take better care of them, give them more opportunities. And the only way to do that is to invest in it. And I think, you can never invest enough when it comes to rural broadband. So, it's a bipartisan issue too. I'm sure the congressman would agree. I mean, we just got to get it done. Again, I'm not trying to oversimplify it, but to me, it's there's no reason to hold this up. This should be a priority. And I know it is for many.
Yeah, Congressman, your thoughts specifically in regards to in the context of the investment levels that the Kip mentioned.
Yeah, well, and I'm not an expert in very much, Spence, but I am an expert in broadband. Before coming to Congress, I was the vice president of an engineering and consulting company, and we laid about 8,000 miles of fiber optic cable a year in rural America. We had 400 clients. Our clients were small rural telecom providers. And so I did business everywhere. I probably traveled to, I don't know how many states, we'll call it 24, in any given 2 or 3 year period with that company. And so I really understand this issue. And I know everybody wants it done immediately. And we use, rural electrification or universal service. And those are good analogies. I mean, the Rural Electric Administration was formed in 1935. 40 years later, we still had 2% of American farms that didn't have electricity. And I'm not suggesting we need to wait 40 years to get everybody connected. We shouldn't. But in South Dakota in the 1980s, we still had party lines on telephones, right? I mean, it takes a little while. We're a huge country with lots and lots and lots of acres. And so I know there is a certain impatience, and that impatience is good, and that it creates an urgency for us to get it done. Most people don't realize how many billions of dollars are invested every single year by the private sector, billions more by the FCC, and then hundreds of millions more every single year by state governments and local governments. And so there is a lot of investments. And the rate of progress, the rate of connectivity is incredible. And so now there is room for improvement. I think we want to make sure that these investments are future-proofed. I think the worst thing we can do is spend taxpayer money delivering a 25.3 or 50 megabit per second solution, and then we're going to have to come right back behind 3 or 5 years later and redo that investment. So that's one thing we can do. Number two, we can make sure that the efforts are better coordinated, as Abigail mentioned. And then I'll just close by noting that I also think we want to make sure that at the end of these glass tubes, we're allowing people to make the best use of that infrastructure. Congresswoman Spanberger and I have worked last year on a bill that made sure that telehealth had some additional resources at the end of the line so that people in healthcare systems could have the hardware that they need, the software that they need to make use of that connectivity, and we want to keep doing things like that.
So the sand in our hourglass is running thin here at this point. So I do want to pivot to some conversations from the viewers of this panel, specifically one for Congressman Johnson. I know this is an area where you've introduced some legislation. We had somebody, Jeremy Ward, ask on some updates for legislation on strengthening local processing. I know this is an issue that you've introduced some legislation on as well. What do you see in terms of prospects for kind of where we go from here on some of those bills?
Yeah, my team would have been so disappointed in me, Spencer, if I didn't, during the whole hour, if I didn't want to get some conversation about livestock. I'm the ranking member. That's the top Republican on the Livestock Subcommittee. And I'm passionate about these issues. And I do think I'm a free market guy, but free market is many buyers and many sellers. And we don't really have a free market in the meat processing space. We have about 4 packers who control 85% of the market. And my comments today aren't an attempt to demonize them, but just to point out that when you have somebody who has that much market power, that can create problems within the marketplace. And so I'm the sponsor of the Direct Act. Democrat Henry Cuellar from Texas is the lead Democrat. And what we want to do is we just want to make it easier for state-inspected meat processors to sell across state lines direct to consumers. I think we strike the right balance in making sure that we are paying attention to food safety, as well as allowing these people to be entrepreneurial and to help create more competition in that processing space. And then I would just close by saying it's just one part of a much larger push we're making, Spencer, as a part of our Price Act, which takes 12 different great legislative ideas, plenty from my team, but plenty from other Democrat and Republican members of Congress too, to just put together a more comprehensive approach that increases transparency, increases producer flexibility on things like forage and grazing and prevent plant, and gives us, I think, collectively, an opportunity to get a lot of singles and doubles that are going to make life easier for folks who are trying to feed the world, one cow-calf producer at a time.
Very good. Kip, want to pivot to you here, and I'm going to take a little bit of a moderator's license and tweak a question that came in from Tom Slate. He had a question relating to China trade and the possibility of joining the Trans-Pacific Partnership. So I guess I'll kind of zoom out on that particular question and just ask you, when we're talking about trade policy and the Biden administration, what is AEM's wish list in terms of that approach?
Well, we are ardent free traders in the equipment manufacturing industry. 30% of all equipment made in the U.S. is destined for export. 99% of our customers, not just for our industry, but for the country as a whole, are outside of the United States. And the only way that we're going to create, we talked about that, some of those great family-sustaining jobs is if we can sell more equipment to markets across the world. And so for us, that's the only way we're going to increase the pie and our share of it. There's some great opportunities, obviously, to keep selling great equipment in the US and in Canada and Mexico, but we got to sell more equipment overseas if we want to create more jobs here in America. So we hope certainly that the Biden administration would take a long, hard look at some of the tariffs that are currently in place, particularly when it comes to some of the key inputs coming from the European Union. That doesn't really help us. It drives up the cost. Obviously, when it comes to China, we were pretty vocal in our support for the Trump administration in their efforts to hold the Chinese, to their bargain. Right? There's been some problems there with that trading relationship. It's not been right sized. We've struggled with issues of intellectual property theft. Some other things, forced technology transfer. So we got to right size that. We got to trade with the Chinese. It's a global economy, but they got to be honest brokers too. So let's solve that problem. The only way we believe that you do that is you work with our trading partners and our friends and allies around the world. Let's strike some deals with Europe, with Japan, with Australia, with Canada, Mexico. We've got that in place now. Together, we can force some change out of the Chinese. Certainly, it's our best bet, but going it alone isn't going to do it. So, we're cautiously optimistic, but we're also hearing some troubling signs about, forcing companies to onshore supply chains. That's not how you create more jobs. Again, we live in a global economy. Every other country that we compete against has global supply chains. Even the French have global supply chains. And so if they all have it and we don't, that puts us at a competitive advantage. And I think that you can create more great paying manufacturing jobs in this country while keeping global supply chains in place. So that's our hope.
Very good. Well, I tell you what, we've got about 2 or 3 minutes here before we hit the top of the hour. Certainly appreciate the two of you stopping by for this conversation. Appreciate everyone that has followed along with it. Want to ask kind of a closing, concluding question of the both of you, and that is that a year from now, when we all sit down together again, we've touched a lot of bases in this conversation: broadband, infrastructure, climate, meat processing, trade. All kind of we sort of run the gamut on farm policy. But a year from today, what can we look at in terms of all the things that we've discussed that have actually been accomplished or advanced? What do you think has some real momentum toward moving to some kind of a conclusion or an advancement here in the next year? I'll start with the congressman on this one.
I don't want to listen. I'm an optimist, and I think we're going to have pretty substantial improvements in all of these areas we've talked about, Spencer, but I don't know that there's going to be one Hail Mary touchdown pass, right? I think in trade deals, we'll get something with Kenya. We'll get a phase 2 with Japan. We'll get something with Indonesia. I think we'll get something with Britain. I think that'll all be good on the margins, right? I think with broadband, we'll have a lot of bipartisanship on broadband. I think on livestock, we already have been successful in getting some funding to help with overtime inspector fees for small processors. I fought hard for that, as did Democrat Angie Craig. I think we'll get more wins like that. And so I know that it's sexy to talk about the big wins, but this is Washington, D.C. It almost never happens like that. Gains are painstaking and incremental and slower than they should be, but we will make a lot of gains.
Very good. And Kip, your thoughts?
Well, I'll take a slightly different approach. I think none of what we've talked about today matters if we can't get COVID under control, if we cannot open up our economy and get people back out and working. So I hope that a year from now, rather than doing this virtually, the three of us are sitting in Yankton or Madison after touring a great plant, looking at some of the great equipment made in South Dakota. We can have a beer and we can have this conversation in person, because if we're still doing this virtually next year, we have bigger problems.
Hey, Spencer, can we erase my answer and just make my answer Kip's answer?
Well, we'll go with that. Yeah, we'll just bleep the audio of yours for a while and really leave up to the imagination what was actually said.
I didn't realize talking about how terrible COVID was and talking about how much I want to drink a beer was an option. I like that.
Yeah. We'll definitely go with that. And at the earliest available opportunity, I look forward to sharing a brew with the two of you, as well as having Congresswoman Spanberger in that conversation as well. But out of respect for your times and your schedules, I will bring the conversation to a conclusion here. Appreciate all of you that stopped by the Agri-Pulse Facebook page to follow this conversation. Appreciate Congresswoman Spanberger taking the time to pre-record some comments, as well as Congressman Johnson for joining us, and Kip and the rest of the folks at the Association of Equipment Manufacturers for their partnership in this webinar. But for now, have a good one.